Hi, this is our replacement video since Zoom is conspiring against us. So this is what we discussed in our Zoom meeting this week for those that couldn't make it. So we're talking about interpreting the neoclassical. Okay, so yeah, we'll talk a little bit about what you all wrote about, then we'll look at the visual world of the Enlightenment, and we'll talk about what Lussein's goals were, and then we'll expand our discussion of neoclassical architecture and monuments, and that will help us introduce the short writing assignment that's due on Saturday. Okay. So yeah, I enjoyed reading what everybody had to say in the replies and reflections on the exchange of letters between Banneker and Jefferson. And what we want to sort of get at here is that Banneker kind of lays bare the contradictions in this concept of Enlightenment equality. That equality works if everyone's the same, but as soon as you introduce either cultural, racial, or gender difference, then suddenly there's this hierarchy that Jefferson says, yeah, it's there, but I'm not going to do anything about it because he himself benefits from this unequal status since he is a slaveholder and a person who is at the top of the heap politically as well, right? So he has a motivation to not change the status quo and to reply to Banneker with that somewhat dissatisfying response, we could say. Okay, so the question here, if we say that the Enlightenment conception of equality was unable to encompass difference, what do we mean exactly? It means everyone's equal if everyone's the same, right? Okay. So these folks, this relates back to what we talked about in the pre-reading lecture as well. These folks were developing a new visual style of stuff they wanted to surround themselves with. And this included new movements in painting and architecture. And so we'll first look at Neoclassicism, and then look at history painting, but first I wanted to show a painting that is neither of those. So this is what a lot of painting looked like before this era of Enlightenment took off as both a political and philosophical movement associated with the American and French revolutions, right? So this is the French painter, Fragonard, this is the swing, and as folks interpreted in our class rightly, this is a kind of light, frivolous, backyard delight kind of painting. There's three people engaged in leisure, kind of a love triangle thing going on here. The tone is very frivolous. There's not like a deep political meaning to the painting. It's a good time painting. It's an entertainment painting. It's a painting that's about enjoying yourself and relaxing and being wealthy, right? We can tell by the way they're dressed and their setting. Okay. So this is not really going to fit with the Enlightenment sensibility that's very self-serious, that's very focused on these big philosophical commitments that are anti-aristocratic, as we mentioned, right, against this nobility, against the elite. All right, so they're like, we need a new school of painting to express our ideas. So this is an example of a neoclassical painting from the British context by the artist Angelica Kauffman. So different world entirely, right? If we just kind of visually look at these couldn't be more different to a great extent, right, in terms of the style and in terms of the content. So we've got figures here dressed in classical garb, right? They've got a kind of toga-style dress that's telling us that we're in this classical past, and in this case we're thinking about the Roman past. And a good clue to look for in paintings is the presence of columns in the background. If you're like, is this a neoclassical painting? Yeah, it's a neoclassical painting, right? We've got the columns in the background, we've got the toga-style dress, we've got the cute Roman sandals on the kids here as well, right? So using these stylistic clues to help us look. The other thing about neoclassical paintings is that they're always trying to teach a lesson. And so the story here of Cornelia is that her neighbor, this lady who's seated, invited her over to brag about her wealth and her amazing gold jewelry. She's like, look at this, I'm the coolest person ever. And Cornelia's like, that's cute, but that's not really what life's all about, right? Life is about this kind of raising up of the next generation of good politicians, good citizens, etc. So this kind of anti-elite, anti-materialist message that's told from the story of Cornelia, this Roman story that the Enlightenment folks would have identified with back in the day. And this is a time when people are starting to read all that old stuff again, read the Roman stories, read the classics again. And so this would have been like, oh yeah, Cornelia, we know her. She's that lady who told off her neighbor for being a materialist. Okay. So then this other painting by Jacques-Louis David is an artist working in France. And he's someone who painted during one of the many French revolutions, but this one in particular that sort of comes off the heels of this revolution in thought that we refer to as the Enlightenment. So this painting by Jacques-Louis David, we've got the telltale costumes. That tells us it's a neoclassical painting. The telltale columns as well. And this is another story from the Roman past that is talking about this need to commit oneself to defend one's community, right? So we've got these three folks gathered tightly together, pledging their loyalty to their community to protect them from a invading force. And then we also see this kind of flip side to it, the women on the other side of the painting sort of reflecting on the tolls of war, right? The stuff that you lose in war, which, you know, people's lives and things of that nature, right? The kind of, the commitment that these folks are making may result in the loss of their life. And so this kind of split in the painting reflects that duality of war, that it is heroic and necessary to commit oneself to a political cause, but there are these really tragic consequences. Okay, so when we're thinking about why these folks are pulling these stories from the Greek and Roman past, many people in class rightly pointed out that, right, the Greeks and Romans were these folks that were identified with these first forms of representative or democratic government, right? And so these folks who are associated with the Enlightenment movement and with the French and American revolutions are interested in representative government. And so they're going to pull from these historical sources that tell us about the nature of representative rule and the nature of representative government. So that makes sense. And the other thing about the Greek and Roman past is that in the sort of pantheon of Western history, so for folks who are sort of part of that cultural tradition, the Greeks and Romans are seen as a pinnacle, a top, right? And so these folks who are associated with the Enlightenment are also envisioning themselves as the next best thing, right? We are the inheritors of this grand cultural inheritance. Okay. So the other thing that these folks do is that they start to paint stuff that they see around them. So instead of like Greek and Roman stories, they start to take a guess at what contemporary events might be super important in the future. And so what we want to think about here is that when they are looking around and speculating on what is going to be important, it tells us a lot about how they see themselves. And it tells us a lot that, you know, these paintings are gigantic. They often take years, so you really have to commit to the subject matter that you are representing. So this is a painting, The Death of General Wolfe. And as our classmates pointed out, we have this very kind of Christ-like figure of the dying general in the center of it, who's right, everyone's gaze, everyone's looking at him at the center of the composition. There's a kind of light falling on him from this kind of troubled sky of the war happening behind them. And so we mentioned that while this is a representation of a historical event, it's not exactly realistic, we'll say, right? It is, in fact, dramatized, right? It is sort of amplified for dramatic and artistic effect, right? To make sure that we know that General Wolfe was this important person and that his death matters, right? And so what we're thinking about here is what work is the artist having us do, right? In this one, it's kind of like, well, he's telling us what's important. He's directing us to a specific conclusion rather than creating a composition that's more open to interpretation. So when we're looking at painting, we want to kind of keep that in the back of our mind. In a few weeks more, we'll look at different approaches to the role of the artist in terms of what they ask the viewer to do. Okay, so yeah, and I mentioned this already. So what does it say about a historical moment or cultural context that they are commemorating recent events in giant oil paintings? It means that they think there's something, right? They think that they're going to matter for all time, that their contributions are on par with, right, this Greek and Roman past, that this is the new classical era that everybody should know about, and so we're going to make giant paintings that tell everybody who we are and what we did. Okay. So then architecture, right? That's what you all read about. And so what we see happening with architecture is that folks are borrowing from the Greek and Roman past, and they're creating these giant kind of displays of national pride, these displays of cultural pride, these displays of individual enlightenment. And as we know and as we read about, these this architectural style works to create the entire kind of mode, the entire style for the young United States. And as you all read about, this kind of outward manifestation of being associated with the ideals of enlightenment and representative government and these ideals of liberty were mismatched with the conditions through which these major edifices were constructed, right? So our chapter focused on the White House, but as Lucene points out, the entirety of the White House was constructed by slaves, right? And so when we're thinking about Lucene's chapter and his purpose, what we're kind of thinking about here is that he is interested in kind of creating a timeline of American history that is fully inclusive of the contributions of African Americans, right? That the contributions of African American individuals in the United States doesn't start after emancipation. It's been a part of American history since the very beginning, right? And the work that it took for him to unearth the names of people, the labor arrangements, and all that kind of stuff is really staggering in his chapter, right? To find out how much money was exchanged and how much the working conditions were quite terrible, and that women were involved in the construction, right? All these really amazing details that I certainly didn't learn in high school, and as many of our classmates suggested as well, that we didn't know until we read Lucene's work, the conditions under which most of these edifices were constructed. Okay. And so, yeah, the kind of vivid creation of a picture of the capital of the United States being this major point of slave trading is a set of imagery that is, puts into contrast the very idealized version of how we often read about and think about the early American context, right? And Lucene's purpose is to kind of bring that into focus. This is a quick excerpt that I'll have you all watch on your own time of Michelle Obama talking about the fact that, she, her daughters, her husband, who are all Black Americans, wake up in a house every day that was built by slaves, right? And so she is similarly trying to indicate that, Obama being in the White House isn't the first time that, Americans have mattered to the history of D.C., to the history of, the kind of development of the United States as well, right? That they've been mattering since 1619, but we have done very little to make that history visible and to celebrate it and to talk about it as well. Okay. So, yeah, this is just a quote from the chapter that I thought was quite evocative for you all to take a look at here. And then when we were speculating about why this history's been minimized or left out of high school and grade school instruction, some of the points that our classmates made was that it pokes holes in that kind of American exceptionalism, that the United States has lots of flaws, and that in some ways it's a little bit disrespectful to high school or grammar school students that they couldn't handle the complexity of, this contradiction between the ideas of the early American Republic and the realities of the early American Republic, right? That also when we're thinking about our experiences in public education, that they are also in the business of kind of creating patriotic citizens as well, and so this perception that if we avoid the bad stuff, then, it'll be okay, and we'll create patriotic citizens, right? But again, this is a really interesting thing, and we can hope that this becomes more a part of our curriculum, because not only is it the truth, it's a really significant truth that creates a more authentic and a more inclusive and a more powerful timeline of American history as well. Okay. So the other place that we see neoclassical architecture that we all will be writing about in the write-up for this weekend is in Plantations, right? So this is a neoclassical style plantation in Georgia, using that same architectural style to use in a private estate. This is another plantation that is in Louisiana. And so when we're thinking about the individual plantation owner, they're seeing themselves as part of the Enlightenment too, right? Even though they are explicitly slaveholders and explicitly engaged in the trafficking of humans for forced labor, they are framing themselves as part of, this classical revival. They see themselves as this enlightened part of this new, amazing, best form of Western culture. So we want to keep that in mind. Okay. So this plantation serves as the backdrop for a music video, right? These plantations are still around. People use them to strangely get married at, right? So people get married at these plantations. But then we also see the way that artists such as Beyonce are beginning to use these spaces to tell a different story. So that's what I'm having you all think about in your work for this discussion of the music video, that I'd like you all to analyze why is she using that imagery? How is she using plantation imagery in the video? And then why is she juxtaposing these time periods between this 19th century plantation space and then contemporary New Orleans as well. So I really look forward to reading what you all have to think about that video and how she's using this imagery. And then does she remake this meaning? Does she reclaim these spaces? Or do they kind of remain sort of this troubled aspect of our past? So that's it.